Habari gani, karibuni to Kumbukeni. Thank you all for being here with us. We're looking forward to everyone who's coming in to join us as we gather and talk about African Liberation Day, which was on Thursday, May 25th. It's every year on May 25th, celebrated by Africans globally. My name is Nduku. Again, I am a Black woman, if you cannot see that for yourselves, who is fed up with going along with an oppressive system while my community suffers under its influence, my community on the continent and globally. So I have said enough is enough, and I'm doing something about it with my brothers. Brother Milton, Brother Colin, please introduce
Yes,
yourselves.
Yes.
global sisters and brothers, global comrades, welcome to another episode of Kumbukeni, where we preach African empowerment. And when we say African, we mean the global African community,
Mhm.
not just the ones located on the continent. We talk about descendants of African ancestry as well, because that's the only way to really realize our power, by embracing our history and the knowledge of our history, and let that knowledge inform us as we deal with contemporary challenges, because our ancestors had the solutions. We just want to remind our people that we must apply those solutions that are well documented to deal with contemporary challenges. So,
Mm-hmm.
welcome. It's a special moment whenever I am on this program. It's like a special classroom for me.
See, that's good to know. Maybe we should have it every day of the week. That way we can all live
No, I mean,
happily.
there's shows that are every day of the week. And no, there are many that, the Young Turks, for example, that
Mm.
Comrade Colin knows very well. And they built up to that. So obviously, that is one day where we want
Mhm.
to be. We want to build up. And that's why we welcome your support. We want to grow so that we can bring you this empowerment message on a daily basis.
Ooh, I look forward to that. And we can throw in some Kiswahili lessons too on one of those days. I look
Mhm.
forward to that.
All
Brother
yours,
Colin?
Colin.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Good afternoon to everyone. Obviously, we're not Uhuru yet.
Mm-mm. Bado.
Obviously, African unity is the main thing we need
Mm-hmm.
to get there, right? So, I'm thinking right now, Brother Bob said Africa unite, and I don't think we could say that enough. So, hopefully, today we also get to the things about what is stifling the
Mm-hmm.
networking and the collaboration that we need to bring about the African unity, right? Because we see that we catching hell wherever you're living in your black skin.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
We catching hell. We getting killed by the police left and right here. Um, you know, and we seeing immigrants running from the richest continent to these places that we enriched for help, and we see the treatment that we get. We see what's happening in places like Libya and all of that. So all of that just to say, yeah, Africa. The topic of African unity is critical.
And for global listeners not familiar, Uhuru, of course, is the Kiswahili word for freedom, for independence. And there is actually a book by the title, Not Yet Uhuru, by Oginga Odinga. It's a
Mm-hmm.
brilliant, excellent book. I bought a copy from a used bookstore, but I think you can find it on Amazon as well.
And please grab one for me, brother, when you stop by that place and they have another one.
Oh,
Mhm.
for sure.
I would love to get it too. And having grown up in Kenya, we have Raila Odinga, his son, who's been trying to be president in Kenya for many years, unable to do so, but has some revolutionary ideas, which is probably why he's never been president.
That's right.
But that is a family that means business when it comes to taking Africa back to ourselves, which is probably why he has never been president.
Yep.
Anyway, so welcome today. I'm going to start, speaking of Bob Marley, Colin, with
Mhm.
a quote from his brother and our brother, Walter Rodney,
Mhm.
at a speech he gave in San Francisco on May 27th in 1972. And in this speech, Brother Rodney is talking about the meaning of African Liberation Day. And he says, there is another illusion which must be squashed. And that is that when we support Africa, we are supporting a foreign entity. We are escaping from the struggle here, but the support of Africa is merely an extension from the struggle here. The struggle is universal because the system of oppression is universal. The struggle is international. And Black unity must be international because we are the world's most authentic international people. We live on every continent through no choice of our own. But when the enemy has created a system of production and a system of exploitation which rests upon our physical presence in the Americas, in Europe, and in Africa, we will use that dispersed presence to mount a tremendous international campaign to liquidate the struggle that has reduced us to the position which we are in now. There are governments in Africa today who are putting their existence out on a limb in order to support the struggle in South Africa. Let me move forward toward a conclusion. Brothers and sisters, a conclusion which asks you to bear in mind what this gathering symbolizes. It symbolizes, that is the African Liberation Day celebration, a no to Nixon, a no to murderous policies in Vietnam, a no to the United States companies which are investing and exploiting on the African continent, a no to NATO, which provides Portugal with wherewithal to bomb and blast our African brothers who are struggling for their rights in their own land. That must be an explicit no. It also is a yes. It is an affirmation. We are saying yes to the line which was developed by people like Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Frantz Fanon, I'm going to add Jomo Kenyatta. We are saying yes to the struggle in Africa today, which is led by such giants as Ahmed Sekou Touré, Julius Nyerere, and we are saying yes to people like Soledad Brothers and the Martyrs of Attica. This time is a symbolic act of coming together. This is also a time for self-analysis and self-criticism and rededication. So we will go from here with a new strength. We will reconsider the nature of the domestic struggle, he's speaking to those in the United States, and its relation to the international struggle. Brothers, let's jump right in. We are at the Berlin Conference in Berlin, Germany. Let's talk about that. The Berlin Conference of 1884. Brother Milton.
Well, in terms of, first of all, I want to address what Rodney is talking about. And what Colin also alluded to in the beginning. We cannot see ourselves as different peoples. We come from the same African origin. In fact, this is what really empowers my students at John Jay College when they realize that without Africans, there would be no so-called Europeans, there would be no so-called Asians, there would be no other people in the world. Because as we know, it was through adaptation, through climatic and environmental and geographical conditions that people took on different features. So in other words, everybody else hails from Africa, whether they like it or not. So once you know
African mother.
Exactly, absolutely. So once you know that, obviously, it makes it abundantly clear that not only are we all tied together as human beings, but of course, in our case, we are discussing the people that I refer to as Africans, right? Because we were subjected to a particular type of exploitation. As Rodney noted, taken to all places and corners of the world unwittingly, and they built the wealth in those places where they were dispersed, right? So he's saying, after knowing that we have that common experience, we have to discuss common solutions. And we have to, first of all, before we can do that, embrace and realize and accept that we're African people. Because if you don't accept that, then obviously it means you're not going to be exploring common solutions. So that's what Rodney was talking. In terms of the Berlin Conference, for listeners that may not be familiar, that was the gathering in Berlin, in Germany, under German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, where the Europeans met to formally partition the African continent and allocate regions to specific European countries so that they don't have to fight amongst themselves for conquest. Their fighting would be against Africans. kill Africans to seize their territory. Now, what's interesting in terms of the Berlin Conference, referencing it today in the 21st century, is that they set up an economic model whereby those territories would be seized so that Europeans could use the land for production of agricultural goods to transfer back to Europe. Foods that are, in some cases, not even edible, like tea, like cocoa, like tobacco, like cotton, like coffee, cash crops. So they produce that to the detriment of even producing food, which is why historically, even up to date, we have recurrent famine in African countries. Africa, with the most abundant fertile land, imports from outside Africa $35 billion worth of food every year. Think about that. That was number one. Number two, they could use the Africans, subject them to cheap or slave-like labor conditions. That's what they set up. And then number three, extract mineral resources. In the early stages, before they started discovering diamond and gold, initially was rubber, and then it transitioned diamond and gold, and then other resources through the decades of colonial rule discovered. But primarily what they did was this. They prevented Africa from industrializing. So Africans, even up to date,
To this day,
and Caribbean countries export what they call raw materials, dug from the ground or taken straight from the farm, just packed and shipped to Europe at relatively very cheap prices. And then they export manufactured products from the factories in Europe and now China as well, whether it's medicines, whether it's computers, smartphones, automobiles, planes. So you can see how the impoverishment established at Berlin still continues up today. To industrialize, you need capital. The major source of capital for African countries is the World Bank. The World Bank will give you money, but on one condition. You don't put the money in factories and industries, because obviously they don't want you to build you into a potential competitor against the European countries that are already industrialized. So that's why Berlin is very important. Berlin is when it began formally in terms of colonization, and Berlin is still what is in play today in the 21st century. So we're still fighting Berlin.
Brother
Off to you,
Colin.
Brother Colin.
So I want to zero in on one particular aspect that Brother Milton hit on when he talked about the partition. And I want to marry it for a minute to something I saw a couple days ago. Give me about a minute to connect it. So a couple days ago, I saw about a 6-minute video by astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was on a podcast, Joe Rogan podcast, right? On that podcast, Dr. deGrasse Tyson pointed out that when these European anthropologists came to Africa, because of their racism, they wanted to just paint everybody as black. He pointed out, however, that just like what Milton said just a minute ago, that humanity started in Africa. And he also pointed out that Africa has the most diversity amongst people. And he gave some examples. He talked about the tallest people were Tutsi, the smallest people, the Twa, or the Pygmies, right? So now here is how I want to marry this, and I want to hear Milton's thoughts and your thoughts, sister, right? So when these European powers that came, they partitioned the country, right, with no thought of the different ethnicities.
Exactly,
right?
That's where we're going.
Right, with no thought or care, and they partitioned ethnicities and split them off. Right. So, being that we, our main theme is that we're talking about African unity and liberation, right? We already have this issue where, because of all these different ethnicities, right, there is a problem right there with unity. And then you put on top of that the partitioning, right, of these arbitrary borders. And so I thought of that when Dr. Tyson was speaking, because I've thought about it before within this same question of unifying us, right? And so I would like some of your thoughts, and I see we have somebody.
Yes, I just keep talking, brother. I just invited one of our brothers. Faisal, are you in Nigeria currently?
No, I'm actually in Cape Town, South Africa.
Ah, all right, yeah. So, Brother Colin, continue. Brother Faisal will join us. It's African Liberation Day, so I wanted to bring in as many African activists as possible so that we can talk about the solutions that we're working on. But Brother Colin, go.
So basically I said it, and so I want to get you guys' thoughts about this particular problem now that we have with unifying.
Okay,
because of the ethnicities and because of what happened with the splitting.
That's a superficial problem. That's a superficial problem because the Europeans had that problem and they have it up to now. The Europeans fought European world wars over that so-called problem of ethnicity and borders. In Africa, they call it so-called tribal wars. That's exactly what they had in Europe. The World War II alone killed 60 million people. They never called that tribal wars. But then they took a pause. They said these are very costly ways of really what they was resolving were economic interests primarily. So they started focusing on the European Union. They started focusing on the common market. So I did say this to suggest that these issues can also be dealt with in Africa. But the leadership have to make a decision. Because even though Africans at the grassroots, on the grounds, they may think and feel brotherly and sisterly toward other Africans, they cannot make the executive decision to eliminate those borders. What they can do is put pressure on the elite. By the way, what we have in Africa is government by the elite, for the elite, from the elite. And that's the problem. So the elite don't see those as critical challenges. The elite don't suffer from impoverishment in African countries. They don't suffer from unemployment. Their children are sent overseas to the best schools. In Uganda's case, the dictator, the hospitals have no medicines. But when dictator Yoweri Museveni's daughter was about to deliver a baby, he did not want to take a chance. So he put her in the 50 million Gulfstream presidential jet, which was purchased by taxpayers' money, and flew her to Germany. She delivered
to Berlin,
and 3 days later. So think about that. So to them, obviously, priority is not the one we're talking about. But I agree with you. To eliminate.
Brother Milton, I want to put it's not a spanner in the work, but maybe let's call it devil's advocate for now.
Yes.
Because the thing is, when you have an African problem, obviously the origins can be contextualized in global history.
Yes.
And I like the book Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. It's about 90 odd pages, because the fundamental question in that book is, how did the world come to be the way that it is? Yes. And if we're going to be answering this question, right, then first we have to understand how is the world. And if I can be crude, in my opinion, sorry, I'm a political scientist by training. I worked in the upper echelons of government, the presidency, and so on. And I have a master's degree in international politics. So I'm just bringing this to the conversation because we Africans have been at odds with the world, but the world has also been at odds with us, and so has history.
Yes.
So I want to say that there are no powerful elites in Africa. I'll tell you why. In my opinion, South Africa, the story of South Africa is the story of Africa. The story of Zimbabwe is the story of Africa. The story of Nigeria, it doesn't matter where you go in Africa. That country's story is our story as a collective. And it is a false narrative, the story of Africa, although it plays out the way that it plays out, right? But where I agree with you is that it's a false narrative, because the original narrative was completely deconstructed in the same way that if you want to go to the definition of genocide, in the same way that genocide happens at a physical level, it also happens at a psychological level, to the extent that those people who are being killed will now kill in the name of those who are killing them.
Mm.
I think the Europeans call it Stockholm syndrome, right?
Yes.
Another European city. But then back to my original interjection, I think when I say there are no political elites, maybe I should define that a little bit more tightly. There are no powerful political elites in Africa. Everybody in Africa, including my president, who I'm sure all of you know, they have handlers, and those handlers live in London, and in Paris,
Yes,
and in Berlin, and in New York, and so they are the political elite, but they are the minions. They are at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to the global elite, and so they are fighting over scraps in the same way that if you go to any village in Africa, the smaller the village, the bigger the fight over the scarce resources, the limited resources they say. So they are going for crumbs. If they get paid $500 million to run a scam worldwide from 2021 to 2020, early days of 23, called this global pandemic that they had, it becomes a moral question. Out of the 200 presidents in the world, who's going to take the 500 million, lie to the people who put them in this power, according to them, and kill them at the same time with this intervention, the vaccines and so on? We can talk about that. But I mean, who must you be? Can you be an African in your marrow, in your DNA, if you say, give me those euros, I will lie to my people, and I will kill them on your behalf?
I don't think you can.
All right,
You
so
can't be.
Let me address some of the points you raised. I don't think we are debating here in terms of, are these elite relative to the global north? They're not. In fact, in previous shows, we've called them Europeans in African skin. That's what we refer them to. As Rodney pointed out, they really don't represent the interests of Africa. And he said that was one of the problems with independence. We never really had true independence. What the Europeans did was they anointed the individuals who would perpetuate and continue the same system that they had set up. They are only elite relative to other Africans, relative to their victims. So what we have, in fact, is a system where we have the elite in the global north extracting resources from the working class in their own countries, and then extracting surplus in Africa at the same time. And then in Africa, yes, we're on the same page on terms of those so-called leaders being the representatives of this global elite. So our people are fighting on two levels. In fact, we're not even engaging effectively in fighting the global North elite, because the African leaders are working as their representatives, meaning we need to fight them first.
It's a distraction. You're right.
Over them before we can engage the global North elite. So we are fighting two enemies at the same time.
It's a distraction.
That is why I call it. But of course, they're not powerful in the whole scheme of things, you know.
So, brothers, you both jumped right into the second point, which was the independent movement, which then brings us to neo-colonialism. So you're way ahead. We're still at the Berlin Conference. For me, the thing that I take away is the fact, yes, Milton, what you said before, that the same things can apply in Europe. The tribal and ethnic wars, the issues with the border and all that still applies to them, and they've managed to keep economic standards progressive and growing, and they've managed to do the business that needs to sustain the people while they continue with their conflict. I mean, look at Ukraine and Russia. We're talking about conflict over borders and stuff. But the thing that is very particular about Africa is that they are not at the table when this is decided in Berlin. And when they are deciding this, the few countries, I believe there were 6 of them, that are sitting there to decide the fate of Africa are not considerate of the cultures in Africa, the existing African states, because there were existing African states, the local patterns of identity, local trade that was already existence, the rivalries that are already there that have been settled, and agreements they've come up to agreements and decided, okay, you stay there, we do our business. They just came and tore it. And in the case of Tanzania, where you have the Masai in Kenya and in Tanzania divided by a border, but it's the same families. You literally have the same families split. So that's the thing that is special about the dividing of Africa. They were not involved, and these issues were not taken into consideration. But also, it wasn't divided for the sake of Africa. It was divided for the sake of Europeans. That's what makes it different from what is going on in Europe. Let's move on then.
And wait, one thing here, let me chime in here too. And I'll be interested to hear what Milton and the brother think as well. The other thing too that I think about is, we have talked about divide and conquer a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Last week I even told you about how in the Caribbean they would tell different people, like even my aunt, that, well, the Africans, them, they don't like you, that type of stuff. So I'm also thinking of it from the standpoint of how these leaders, right, use these different ethnicities and communities to fight one another, right? You could probably talk about maybe like Rwanda, right? And so I think that is still something that I believe we still have to grapple with, right? Because that particular tactic is still in use, right?
And there comes in greed and self-serving mindsets, right? Which are not African in themselves. We've always been a collective people, but the colonialists come in, they divide us, they favor some tribes over others, and they bring in this mindset of greed. I keep for myself. And therefore, the people that you're mentioning are getting paid and given weapons to destroy fellow Africans. And who's coming in Rwanda? It's the French are bringing in the machetes, for heaven's sake, right? Okay. The US and everyone. So let's move on to the.
My philosophy is that while there's an appropriate level of external blame that we need to apportion, we have to embrace some of the responsibility.
I agree.
So the key thing I'm saying is that even if those borders were eliminated overnight, right, there's still many issues that we need to deal with. And fundamentally to me, that is the issue of economic power. We don't have economic power, and that determines a lot of what some people in the left would call the superstructure, right? The foundation is very fundamental. So if we are not in charge of our production, what we decide to produce, what we use domestically, what we export to the world, then removing the border in itself is going to be meaningless. Removing the border is only a part of it, and it will benefit us by creating large markets, immediately. If the border removal is accompanied by the new set of laws, which now promotes free export and import, free movements of people. And that's the point I'm trying to make.
There's also the mindset that has to be the beginning, right?
Of course,
the fact that we've been colonized, the fact that we should not.
We won't do any of these things.
That is the beginning, essentially.
We start from here. But the brother from South Africa wants to talk.
Yeah,
brother
sorry.
Yeah,
thanks a lot. Thanks, Colin, for the input that you made. It really resonates with me. And then the subsequent points by Nduku and by Milton. I wanted to say, let me exit point one of the conversation by referring to another book by Chancellor Williams, I hope you guys have heard the title, you've read it, and so on.
Destruction of African civilization.
There we go. So the point, the crude point I wanted to make in reference with the first book is, so what is this world that we're living in, right? How did it get here? But then what is this? We are living in a white world.
Yes.
Exactly.
We're living in a patriarchy.
Exactly.
We're living in a patriarchy, and we're living in a Christian world.
Exactly.
That's the world in a very crude tripartite of issues. That's the world that we live in. So in that world, in Africa, you have the situation that we have today. We are consumed by Stockholm syndrome. We are complicit and have been assimilated into our own subjugation for hundreds of years. But it gets more and more sophisticated. Yes. Obviously, because, we are in pursuit of civilization. The world is becoming more civilized and more brutal at the same time, right? More barbaric at the same time, right? So the unity, I agree. The lines have got nothing to do with where Africans should be living. Those lines, those geometrical lines were drawn for other purposes, for the purposes of underdevelopment and for the purposes of divide and rule.
Yes.
And for the purpose of chaos. We shouldn't forget that, because in the politics of destruction, there should at least be something. And that's why you have family feuds for hundreds of years, tribal feuds for hundreds of years. There should be something simmering. If there isn't something causing chaos now, like famine or this, that, and the other, there should be something simmering. And then they come.
It will be introduced, yes.
Yeah. The French come with their euros or their francs, and they say, okay, so let's go and blow on that fire.
Yeah.
So if we are going to be moving this conversation forward in the direction of then how do we liberate Africa, then redrawing the boundaries is a part of the detail. It's not even a part of the priorities. It's a part of the detail further down. So I wanted to just make sure that I said enough about this first point, introductory point, and so on. I really appreciate the opportunity that you guys are taking, everyone, for listening to us here.
Thank you, Brother
Faisal. It's a global conversation.
While we have you here, I will take the opportunity and the advantage of having a South African brother with us here. How is it going there? Quick 1 minute. How is it going in South Africa? What are you all doing about? I'm watching Malema on TV. We're going to play one of his videos in a few minutes. What is going on? What is the action that the people are taking there towards liberation? Quickly, 1 minute.
I think as a former I don't want to say as a former activist, as an anti-apartheid activist starting in Standard 6, which is grade 8 these days.
Yes, I remember Standard 6. Yep.
Yeah, I'm at a loss of words. And being a political scientist, I don't understand what is happening, because the South Africa is known for its active citizenship, and it's not happening. The government is artificially, illegally, and through and fraudulently putting us in darkness every day for between 2 hours and 12 hours. And nobody's out in the streets, like going to these people and saying, but where is the problem? Because there's always maintenance and all of these things, and I know that it's nonsense, because this thing actually came up 10 years ago as a fraudulent scam, right? And so in South Africa, I think at the moment there's really low levels of active citizenship, of mobilization, and so on. But at least there are small, tiny pockets where it's still happening. I do have something to say about Julius Malema, but the overall statement.
He's a friend. Go on. Go on.
Now you're putting me under pressure.
No. Speak your mind, brother.
I am going to absorb that pressure, because I can only speak my truth, right?
Yes.
I wanted to make an overall statement first. If there are some among us, in the audience in particular, who don't know or don't realize that in terms of the global narrative, the dominant narrative carried by MSM, mainstream media, the owners and the managers of the dominant narrative, they are simultaneously the owners and the managers of the counter narrative. So
Look
what
at Milton
what
laughing.
let me see if I can explain this to my 4-year-old.
Thank you.
I want to use democracy as an example. In a democracy, the people get to elect the government, and then the government allows them to criticize them. So what the government says goes, but you can dissent from the government. You get labor laws. You can even go on a riot. You can take to the streets. You can call a strike and so on. So it's both in the same constitution, the narrative and the counter narrative. Now, if you take that to everything else that you ever read in the papers, ever watch on television, ever hear on the radio, and so on, all publications produced by mainstream media is owned by two companies. And those two companies on their website, Vanguard and BlackRock, they say, our vision is to create a world where nobody needs to form their own opinions because we have so many that we just put out there every day so that people can pick one. All right. So Julius Malema, firebrand, good friend of yours, but in terms of the example that I made, what he is being handled himself. He is being told what to say. He knows what is allowed and what is not allowed. The reason he doesn't go to jail for some of the things that lesser people would go to jail for is because he's in the system. He's a part of the whole thing.
Interesting.
And so there are no holy cows. Revolutions should have no holy cows. Any move towards a completely, truly united Africa, this includes the diaspora. No holy cows, and no statues, and no bronze busts, and no paintings, and no nothing until people are dead, because when they are dead, they can't betray the revolution. This is a leaf from the Cuban Revolution that I based this on.
Brother Milton
So
and Brother
that's my
Cohen.
answer.
Please respond to this one. Brother
No, we
Milton, I
can't
see you.
respond because
right.
this is something that Julius Malema should have to respond to himself.
Okay.
The
All right.
brother has laid out the reasons why he said the things he said, and I think he's backed it up, with analysis.
Should we invite our brother to join us when he has a chance to respond to this?
Of
He's
course,
watching?
he can. In fact,
Yeah,
we
can.
should have both of you together on the same platform next time.
Yeah. That'll
And
be
if
cool.
you have a way to help us arrange that, also let us know, please.
Brother Malema, you're welcome. Come defend yourself. All right, moving on. Independence movement. We've touched on it just a little bit as we were talking about, but let's go through that. The thing that I would hope that we inform our community and the community globally is that the independence movement in Africa was not only happening in Africa, right? It started actually in the West. It started in Europe. It started in the US when African leaders were in school with Caribbean brothers and sisters who'd been taken from the continent who were in the US and who were in Britain. When they gathered and they started talking about their issues together and what needs to be done, that's where it started. So let's talk about that, Brother Milton. Independence movement.
I think you're talking about the Pan-African Congresses beginning at the turn of the 20th century. The most famous one, of course, was the Fifth Pan-African Congress of Manchester in 1945. And of course, one of the key organizers were brothers from the Caribbean, like George Padmore of Trinidad. And in that particular conference, the other people that played a prominent role was Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah. And many of them that participated in that Congress, in fact, became leaders later on in the countries, including Kamuzu Banda, Dr. Kamuzu Banda, a medical doctor that later on became one of the most reactionary of all the African presidents. But all right, so I welcome that, and I also see it from the perspective of Walter Rodney. He has that very nice speech on YouTube, Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. And he says, yes, independence, formal political independence, was a dramatic and significant moment in Africa's history. But it was not a sufficient condition. It was unnecessary, but not sufficient. In other words, it opened the way for opportunities. But he said, at the end of the day, what we had were these political parties, which were relatively elitist parties compared to what needed to be done in African countries. And what we need, what we lack, what we don't have, are parties that are operated by the working class. And of course, in African countries, the formal system of the economy, not that relatively developed. So when he said working class, he's using a very broad definition that would actually include students as well, which would actually include even peasant farmers as well. In other words, people that are engaged in some form in production. They should create that party, they should lead that party, and they should pursue and dictate the interests of those parties. In fact, he said these political structures that we have were relatively reactionary. And then brings me back to the first point I was making. They were representatives, and they are representatives of the IMF and World Bank model, which, of course, is meant to preclude African countries from ever industrializing, from ever able to compete with the industrialized countries of the world, with the West. And that's the dilemma we face today in the 21st century. And that's why now with the US sanctions that's just going wild all over the world, the Ukraine war, there's much more interest in the BRICS countries now. There are more countries that are actually trying to apply to become part of BRICS. And BRICS, of course, is pursuing an alternative solution to the US dollar. And they see that as another path to liberation. So long as you're controlled by the US dollar, by the IMF and the World Bank, any possibility of taking another approach, another model, a pro-Africa model, a pan-African model, will always be frustrated.
Thank you, Brother Colin.
So I wanna throw something out and ask a question again. So before the Organization of African Unity was founded in '63, you had this split, right, where you had the so-called Casablanca group led by Kwame Nkrumah, and you had the Monrovia group by Senghor.
Brother, you're dropping a little. Your mic, I think.
Oh, my mic is
the sound.
You hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question why I want to ask it, because the Monrovia group believed in quote unquote gradual unity as opposed to the Casablanca group that wanted, to just unite, right?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what gradual unity is. So and the Monrovia group also, they wanted, the more autonomous control. So my question here is, isn't this the clear selfishness of leaders who were more thinking about their individual power than the benefit of the people? And isn't this where the unity was crushed even before the OAU started?
And it's still going on today.
Brother Vice Faisal go first, because he has referred to them as, they have handlers, and I agree with that. But let him handle that, and then I'll give my own view on this issue.
Secretly, I hold the view that the Organization for African Unity was a Western creation. And I think they basically created the European Union on more or less the same mold. But of course, if you look at the constitutive documents and the legacy, the track record of the African Union, and you look at the legacy or the track record of the European Union, it's completely different, because they have different definitions. So hypocrisy is the Vaseline of political intercourse, right? So
I don't think all of our listeners are old enough. But go ahead.
I don't think we were ready, but go on. It is life. This is how they all get here. Go on.
Sorry.
That's good. No need to apologize.
So in politics, you have to have two sets of values, two sets of rules for two sets of people. And Africans are always going to get like that set, and you can't change them. Here in the European Union, we can change things and so on, because, we're white and all of that. But the fearful thing is that when the African Union actually changed into the African Union, the AU, the Organization for African Unity into the African Union, it was so scared of Muammar Gaddafi, because I think if you look at it broadly, the time that Muammar Gaddafi lived in, he's probably the one president of a country, leader of a country, that didn't need anything. Like, he didn't need foreign direct investment. He didn't need anything. I mean, he had free education, free healthcare. His people loved him, and so on. Why were they so afraid of him? You must remember, this happened on the watch of what is called South Africa's most learned president, former President Mbeki.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, what was his Pan-African legacy? Is this thing about African Renaissance, right? So I don't have much time for African leaders who spend more time on being poets than doing anything in their countries.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I actually wrote to Thabo Mbeki on LinkedIn, and I said to him, because he was saying, what is it that Africa needs to be free? Before we can answer that question, we must find out, what is it that we need from our leadership? But before we can answer that question, we must find out what is it that Africa needs, and then find out if Africa has these leaders, right? So he goes down a whole list of things, and I write to him and I said, so you are saying that you had none of those qualities. You were president for almost 2 terms. You did nothing of the things that you are asking African leaders to be today. Is this hindsight? Is this, or is this oversight at the time? You didn't think about these things when you were the president, and so on.
Hypocrisy.
Yeah.
But exactly, see, on the issue of Pan-Africanism and its possibilities, the thing is, it must be possible, because before the Asians and the whites came here, there was a semblance of African unity here. You had tribal wars and so on, but if you look at systems and structures and processes, there was a unified way of existing on the continent, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the one thing that right now today, Africans and their leaders make 2 mistakes. They say we live in this Africa, which is this black continent that's impoverished and so on, and want to change this thing. And so let's go and get some money from the North and the West and some solutions. And the thing is, why would they solve this thing that they created and it's still working for them? They wouldn't. There's no incentive for them to correct their injustice. They've not even claimed it. I mean, there are 1 or 2 countries that's apologized for slavery, right? But they didn't say, come and empty our treasury so we can start paying you back.
Right.
Because if they do pay Africa back as a continent, they will all go down the drain the same day that they make that payment. They don't have anything if they don't have us, right?
Yes.
Yep.
So that's the one. We are still relying on. I mean, you get 50 presidents going to visit one president in New York or in Washington, and we run as these African, and they put them in buses like school kids, right?
Yeah.
But they went to see Biden, no self-respect. They have no self-respect. I mean, if they're gonna go use taxpayers' money, 54 boys, and girls go over and to the head boy's office and so on. To me, it's the most ludicrous thing.
No, I agree.
The second thing that we are doing is we think that the Pan-African liberation rests with political leadership, and it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. Thank you. Speak on that, brother.
And the last thing that I want to say actually about this is independence. Yeah, I think lots of countries on Africa obviously celebrate independence. I think we have it we call it Freedom Day, 27th of April and so on. But here's a very important distinction that we must make. I remember being in the streets. I remember throwing petrol bombs. I remember all those things. But I don't remember any of the posters and the placards saying, we want democracy now. We want democracy now. We never said that. We never said that. We said freedom now. Freedom in our time, in our lifetime. That's what we said. So we fought for freedom and they gave us democracy. And that is one of the reasons why we are here. Because democracy, as defined by Webster and all these European dictionaries, doesn't fit on Africa. Africa had a much better democracy before they came here. Mm-hmm. So that's the lead in, I think.
Just to talk on that quickly, Brother Milton, before you speak, just on that last point that our brother Faisal just mentioned. I think the problem we have in Africa is the people are clear on what they want. They're on the streets saying what they want. But the problem that comes in is when it comes to decision making, it's the elites that sit at the table with white people asking, right? Asking, as if freedom and liberation and your humanity is to be asked for. That's the problem. And when you ask and you include your oppressors in finding solutions, they will give you solutions that benefit them, not you. I think that's the problem. Brother Milton.
All right, so the brother touched on many interesting points. I first want to go back to what Colin said in terms of the Casablanca and Monrovia group. I think the brother is suggesting that all those were, fictitious narratives in the first place. This is something came up very interesting. Many years after Kwame Nkrumah already passed, Julius Nyerere, very prominent, of course, of all the African leaders, visited Ghana. And he made a speech, and he said Nkrumah was right in terms of his urgings that we must unite immediately. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult in subsequent years. And Nyerere said, it's true. Once you have your own state house, you have your own national anthem, you get used to this, your artificial sovereignty, even though you control nothing. And in subsequent years, as the years went by, it became much, much, much more difficult. So when he reflected back, he said, he agreed with Nyerere. At the same time, there is a cost to African unity, a cost to your life, in fact, at the end of the day. So to what extent were they actually determined for real African unity, which would have a United States of Africa or United Federation or African nations? To what extent? Knowing what had happened to Patrice Lumumba in 1960. So were they really expressing their true views, or were those all superficial conversations?
Exactly.
Because all of them knew the ultimate consequence of real African unity. That's the first point. And the second point, I am a big fan of the late Samir Amin. And Samir Amin's argument was that we should take this energy of Pan-Africanism, but go beyond just celebrating a commonality of heritage and skin color.
Mm-hmm.
He said that's a bit superficial. Let's use this Pan-African energy for economic cooperation. And he said we can start building powerful regional economic zones by sharing the resources that we have. Certain countries have the benefit, and then let certain countries who have the labor. Certain countries have the geographic location, which opens up the ports for export. So why don't we focus on building that broad economics regionally initially, and then continentally ultimately? So I'm a big, big fan of that approach. And going back to Brother Faisal's point on democracy, that is also something that Rodney addresses in the speech, Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. He said that has been one of the biggest deficits. Once the first generation of leaders came, they said, we know what the solutions are. We know best. So what they started focusing on was referendums where people vote not to ever vote again, And he said, and these referendums were passing by 80 or 90% of the vote, without noting that only 10% of the people, would be voting. And that he was a very critique of the authoritarianism that became very pervasive in most African countries. And my own definition of democracy is this, in a very simple and crude way. The people should be able to overthrow you easily. And if they can't overthrow you easily, then you have a complete autocratic system. You control the military, the police, the secret police, the judiciary, the prison system, and Okay, so I rest. Go ahead.
Brother Milton, Brother Colin, did you have anything more to say on that, or we can move on?
No, we can move on.
All right. So I was going to play Malema, and it's not because of what Faisal said that I'm not playing Malema. It's because his video is 3 minutes and 51 seconds, and we are at 1 p.m. almost, and we want to share the solution, talk about solutions and not have Malema take it away with 351. Because what Malema is telling us, I can say quickly, is that Kiswahili needs to be the language that we start teaching throughout Africa because it's uniting. And we need to have a uniting African language. Kiswahili. Why Kiswahili? Because it is spoken in most African countries today. I'll add also because it doesn't have that what they call tribal allegiance, where if the next tribe speaks it, this tribe will be upset. So if for us in Kenya, tribalism is about a certain tribe being favored or that. If we use Kiswahili, we won't have this issue, and I think is why Kiswahili should be embraced. But I'm biased as well. I am a Swahili speaker, so those are my 2 cents on that. Let's talk about solutions. As you were talking about what you would like to see, Brother Milton, I was thinking about Agenda 2063. Put a pin on that one. I was thinking about CARICOM. Put a pin on that one too. Before we go on, I want to again read a few words from our brother Walter Rodney. And yes, I am biased towards Walter Rodney. Why am I biased? Because his words are words of wisdom, and because he did not only speak, all right, he actually took his words and went to the streets and put them into action. And so he is someone I want us to embrace as much as possible and live the way he lived if we're going to get anywhere towards liberation. So he says in the same speech I read before, and I have put the link in the chat at the beginning, he says, I have met brothers and sisters who say that their mother tongue is, quote unquote, French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, as well as English, which we speak. And because of this, we have a problem of identification. We do not know who we are. And that is why this gathering is of great symbolic importance, because it is an act of identification. We are saying, this is African Liberation Day, we are saying that we identify with the African people of the African continent. We are saying that we are an African people. And when we make this identification, we have no illusions about the fact that this is a very revolutionary initiative. It is a rejection of every other form of identification which the white society has asked us to accept. And here comes in the mindset. Let's talk about it, brothers. The mindset that the white man's ice is colder. The mindset that the West produces products that are of higher quality than Africa, where you have Africans making clothes, but you're not going to buy their clothes. You're going to buy clothes from the US because to you, they have higher quality. The mindset that music in Africa, who listens to African music? I've heard black people tell me this. I don't listen to African music.
Yeah, that's changing. That part is changing with the Afrobeat. That's
right.
changing.
But because
everything else I agree with.
But because Afrobeat has taken in qualities that are in the West. A topic for another day. We can talk about that when we bring in our brother Sean Kuti. But brothers, let's talk about this, the mindset. The fact that we want to walk around proud talking about I speak French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, English, and not an African language.
All right, so I'll deal with a few of the issues you raised. First, I'll go back to the word tribe. I personally don't use that word for the same reason that Walter Rodney does not. He says these were like concoctions, just like the system used race to disguise, capitalism exploitation. So in Africa, they use so-called tribes, and even the post-independence, post-formal independence leaders have also used that. So you can give the same analogy. They use it just in the same way for divide and rule, the way the European establishment used so-called race to divide and rule while pushing the agenda. So that's the first point. In terms of the mindset is very important, because everything that we're discussing right now, you have to be in the mindset to embrace it, right? You can't reject it at the same time, enjoy it. It's almost like, reminds me of that short speech by Malcolm X. You can't hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree. And some people are in that condition subconsciously, not even knowing that by hating Africa descendants in the US were actually, hating themselves. And Samara Machel, there's a speech he made, which is kind of funny, actually. He said, so African minds were conditioned. You have Africans in West Africa saying, oh, we were colonized by the French, very sophisticated. So it means we're somehow much more advanced by you in Mozambique. You were colonized by the lowly Portuguese, So he was making it as a joke, but it was very effective. It speaks a lot of truth to power. So what we have is a lot of self-hatred, you know. You have self-hatred. And it's very tough to do anything to construct your life, to improve your life. If you don't think you're worthy, then you are contemporary condition. Let me see. I'm trying to see if I missed any other points in your comments, because it goes back, it relates all to everything you're talking about: identification, self-identification. And of course, Rodney in his speech was talking about that importance to embrace our African heritage.
Brother Langston says we love our colonizer. Unfortunately, a lot of Black people love our colonizer.
Very well put.
Can you imagine, right?
Yeah.
Thank
The
you.
person
Yes,
is whipping you, putting you in ships, throwing you
You can't
overboard.
beat
And
that.
yes, Massa, we sick, Massa. All right, go on, Colin.
Okay, sorry. You said
So,
something like Swahili too. Sorry. You said something like Swahili.
Yes.
I endorse that. It is an African language which is relatively, there's not so much proprietary attachment to it. So I can see it being widely acceptable. Sorry, go ahead, Brother Colin.
So I definitely endorse, learning African languages. Of course, I'm going to interject some Bob right
Please
now.
do.
So, and redemption song, what did Bob say? Emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds, right? We have talked about Walter Rodney so much, and of course, you know that Walter Rodney, and he is a central person in the Rastafari movement, right? Which I became involved with at a young age, right? So, and the Rastafari people, of course, we got and we still get fight because we were trying to retain and recapture all things African, right? And we had to go up against the other side who want to destroy all things Africa. So now we talking about solutions part. Sister a minute ago talked about CARICOM, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll be particularly interested in what my brother in South Africa thinks. He seems to be on the ball and a lot of stuff here. So in the last several years, we had the the Leaders Summit that was referenced before, where we had all the African leaders fly to Washington, right? To me, one of the only good things I thought came out of that was the Ghanaian president's speech, where he actually put out a call to Africans in the diaspora saying, we need you, you are a part of us, and we need you to liberate Africa. He also talked about, making things easier for travel between diaspora and Africa. We also had the African CARICOM Summit in 2021, which I think has great potential. It remains to be seen where it will go. But in that summit, they talked about economic empowerment. In particular, they talked about the blue wave, right? Basically, doing more to explore all the economic possibilities that are falling through the cracks, in our waterways around the continent and in the Caribbean. The other key thing that they talked about, again, was the facilitating of movement between our people in the diaspora and on the continent. So I think it has a lot of potential.
Mm-hmm.
I would be interested in what my brother in South Africa, if he knows, I'm sure he knows about it and what he thinks
Brother Faisal.
about that in particular.
Yeah, thanks. Let me start off because this section is about, so what can we do? What is being done? And there's a lot happening actually in pockets across the continent. I mean, I'm sure most of you have seen my brother from Zimbabwe, Rutendo, talk very intelligibly, highly intellectually on some of these things, and is really done such a lot of research in just in terms of studying the facts.
Correct.
That one of the things that I actually am aspiring to do is to bring a television broadcast company onto the continent that doesn't really have ties with the North, but more with the South.
Thank you.
And actually have people like him, people like all of you, regularly on these talking programs. So because one of the things so I am part of a group called the Emerging Al-Kabulan.
Yes.
And one of the reasons I joined them is I said there are a number of things that is wrong here, and there's a number of things that we will make an effort to contribute towards correcting on the continent. And so Pan-African unity and all of those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But everything, it doesn't matter how beautiful the paper is we write it on, and it doesn't matter how beautiful the language is we're writing it with.
Yeah.
If we are going to insist on egos and holy cows, for instance, we can't change the name. Of course we can change the name. We can change the name any day, like tomorrow,
Correct.
Or I have to be a leader. No, I don't have to be a leader. I want to sit here and I want you to hear what I'm saying.
Yes.
Right? I don't need to be a leader. And so everybody's basically in agreement. Just give me a second.
You do not need to be a leader to do something about the situation. Right?
Sorry, say again.
No, I was speaking as you were doing what you were doing. You do not have, I'm speaking to our brothers and sisters out there listening to us, not listening to us. You do not need to be a leader to do something about the situation we are in.
Exactly.
But you must get off the sofa.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I think South Africans have become couch sofa politicians. That's why we don't see them. That's why we don't see them in the streets anymore. Anyway, so the Emerging Al-Kabulan recognizes all of the worthy efforts across the continent, and really what we're trying to do is we want to say all of us are doing all these things in our pockets. Let's try African unity at just this level. Let's say we are 10 or 50 of these little groups. Let us just unite, and it doesn't matter what the name is in the end. So right now we're in mobilization phase. We've registered an entity in Nigeria and so on. But I liked what Milton said around economic unity, because we completely agree with that. You can't change anything for the African child unless you change African economics. And African economics is one of the two, in my opinion, most scary things for the West and the North.
Exactly.
So African economic unity and African military unity are the two scariest things. And that is why they overinvest. And brothers and my sister, I don't use terms like neo-colonialism and neoliberalism and neo-Nazism and all of these things, because if it's neo, who came up with these terms? The thing is, this is still the same colonialism. They just changed the strategy and tactics. So there's nothing new about this stuff. We are still here after thousands of years. We are still here. They don't have a new strategy. They're doing the same thing. They just have better technologies now, right?
You are bringing.
So there's no neo. There's no neo nothing.
You're bringing some refreshing awareness and self-reflection, brother. Thank you so much. Yeah. Because this is the work that we must do too. We have to look at ourselves and see how we are contributing in the ridiculousness.
Absolutely.
Go on, brother.
And talk about the narrative. I mean, self-hate is a construct from the French and the Italians and the Portuguese and the British and the Germans who came here, and they taught our people how to hate themselves. You have a white
and
man.
they became experts in it.
You have a white man sleeping with a black woman, making a brown child who abandons his mother, his culture, his village, his everything, because he's paler. He wants his father's everything, right? So fast forward thousands of years to 2023. We're sending Ghanaian students, Cote d'Ivoire students, South African students to
Kenyan
British,
students.
Kenyan students to European universities. And at the second or the third break, the one guy says, "Hey, I'm going back to Ghana today. When are you going back to Botswana?" Guy says, "No, I don't think I'm gonna go this time. You know, I don't feel comfortable at home, and those people can't relate. They aren't really my people, you know."
Yep.
Yeah.
So now the white man taught you by giving you a degree to hate your people. And is this new? No, this is 5,000 years old, right?
Yes.
So
There's nothing new about it. You're right.
Exactly. So when I say we need to reclaim the narrative, because these are the dominant narratives, and we can't look in the same space where the dominant narrative is for the counter narrative, because remember, the counter narrative is managed by the same people, right?
Yeah,
Very good.
brother,
But
I'm gonna need to just go back to listen to this later just to sit in your words, because and I advise everyone to do that. There's a lot you're saying there that we need to actually sit and think about how we're going to move forward. It's important. Thank you so much for that. Yes, continue, please.
can I take the minute to just finish my thought
Yes,
here?
please. Sorry.
Right.
Yes, please.
So of course, when I say we should stop looking north and west for the solutions, we should have the best. We had the best universities in the world on this continent. We should just get them back, right? So then we change the narrative. We go on a pan-African wide re-education, reimagination, and we start with the old people at the same time as we start with the youngsters, with movies, going on TV, house to house visits. You know, the establishment hate political mobilization, like going house to house, because they can't do that. They have to use technology. But I need to look into people's eyes, and people need to look into my eyes. And in Nigeria, for instance, there's Arioba. They do animation, amazing animation, and you just, by stories, tell the story, and then how to change that story, because now this boy is going to grow up, this girl is going to grow up, and they're going to change the story, right? I mean, we won't probably see the stuff in our lifetime, but at least my kids should be able to benefit from our efforts right now, right?
Correct.
I just want, and then my final point on language and so on is, I really feel for the liberation theologists in our history, because one of the key dilemmas that they had was, they said, we can't even theologize the liberation of Africa without using the language of the white man.
Correct.
So all of them, Franz Fanon, Du Bois, all of them, they were saying, how do we free ourselves if we have to use this language? So now, Malema and others, we've been saying the same thing. There should be a single currency, a single military, and there should be a single language. But across Africa, you have all of these other official locally spoken languages.
Correct.
But the official language of government communication and so on should be Swahili. And I love learning new languages, right? So, and the last point on this is, so if we are reclaiming the narrative, what were we claimed before, when there were only Africans here? What were we called, when there were only Africans here? And who started calling us black?
Correct.
And why are we calling ourselves black? Because we've been assimilated. I mean, our brothers and sisters in America, they call themselves house nigger, and nigger this, nigger that, and the other. It is the worst thing. It is the worst extend to being complicit in your own subjugation. And calling somebody a nigger is dehumanizing. And so it's okay for a nigger to call another nigger a nigger. No, it's not. It's actually not. And so we need to go back to what we called ourselves, and then call ourselves that again. But let's stop this thing of calling ourselves what other people are calling us. That is the worst kind of disrespect, self-disrespect, I think. And I think a part of the winds of change that's sweeping across Africa is coming from insignificant countries in Africa. Mali.
Correct.
Coming from Benin. It's coming from Rwanda. It's coming in little bits and drips from Zimbabwe, where I think it's in Mali, where they basically tore up 9 of the 13 agreements that keeps the French colonialism in place.
Correct.
So these are the guys that we need to target for conversations like this. We need to flood their offices with requests to speak, because you see, they will go onto mainstream TV and so on. My brother Colin, can you remind me of that one point? I didn't actually make a point of it.
I was just asking about the CARICOM, the Africa CARICOM summit. You know,
that was held in South Africa.
No, they did it online.
Okay.
It was like an online thing. With Kenyatta, and Gaston Browne was the CARICOM chairman at the point.
Yeah, I can fit that in my response.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, brother. We are at 1:17. Just to let you all know, we have about less than 15 minutes to finish, and I want us to also touch on the 2063 African.
And I'll just take a minute
agenda.
on that. I think what is important in that conference, where you have sisters and brothers, the leadership in the Caribbean countries, now engaging directly with leadership on the African continent, even though, of course, the type of leadership needs to improve. But the conversation itself is an achievement that they're having that conversation. Right. It's different from your era when you had leaders like Prime Minister Shearer in Jamaica. He's the one that expelled Rodney from the University of West Indies and revoked his visa.
Right.
And of course, students knew what was going on, and they had an uprising because of that. Tore up some buildings in Kingston as a result of that. They knew what the conservative reactionary leadership was trying to deprive them of, the knowledge, the fact that Rodney was going to the streets, and as he called it, groundings with the sisters and brothers, with the masses, from the ivory tower, to the trenches, to the front line. That's what he was doing. So I like it in the sense that we have a different type of leadership now, maybe not all the way there, but qualitatively much better than the ones we had in the era when Walter Rodney was deported from the country. And I like one in particular, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Bartley.
Yes.
She talks the real deal. In fact, she addressed what Brother Faisal said in the beginning. We have to know how the world became the way it is today. There's a short interview that she had, a clip probably of a longer interview, where the reporter was asking her, this European reporter, basically said, why is the problem always the same? Corruption, employment, blah, blah, blah.
And she turned it around, yes.
First of all, let's get one thing off the table. Corruption in Europe and all these industrialized countries. Same thing. Bigger, in fact. But to get to the real response to the question you posed, we are still talking about a system of exploitation that started from the era of enslavement that is still in place today, extracting resources from our countries, imposing these debts upon our countries, imposing cheap labor upon our country. Those explain for the contemporary conditions. So I like that she was one of the first leaders who were responding to Western journalists by putting things in the broader historical
perspective. So quickly, as we have 10 minutes left, I'm going to go through quickly the flagship projects for the Agenda 2063, and then we'll talk about them and whether you think they're possible, if they're possible, how we should go about it. Okay, so there are 15 of them, and it's integrated high-speed trade network within Africa, formulation of an African commodities strategy, establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the African passport and free movement of people, silencing the guns by 2020, that is getting rid of civil wars and all that. Implementation of the Grand Inga Dam project, Central Africa, Inga. Establishment of a single African air transport market. Establishment of an annual African Economic Forum. Establishment of the African Financial Institutions, African Investment Bank, Pan-African Stock Exchange, African Monetary Fund, African Central Bank. There was a lot of problems with those ones. Anyway, the Pan-African E-Network. Brother Faisal talking about networks. African Outer Space Strategy. An African Virtual and E-University. Cybersecurity. Great African Museum, the African Charter for African Cultural Renaissance, and the Encyclopedia Africana. Brothers, let's tear this up, break it up. What is possible is the sum of this. We know the AU's budget is massively handled by the West or funded by the West, right? And therefore, do you see Western fingerprints in these, and how do we take those fingerprints off and make these work for Africa?
I'll go first because my answer is very short. All these things are achievable, attainable. These are what we aspire to. It will not be done through the African Union. It will be done by changing the leadership in African countries. It will be done by the kind of leadership that the youth who are coming out on the streets are now imposing on the government in countries like Mali. I don't think what's going on in Mali right now was the original intent of Assimi Goïta. I think he's Colonel Assimi Goïta. I don't think that was his vision when he seized power in that country. But the youth have their own vision, and they're imposing their vision on the leadership in Mali. We need to impose that same kind of methodology throughout Africa. And then once we have the right leadership, everything that you listed and outlined, all of them are attainable, but not through the African Union.
Yeah.
And
Well, I gotta echo Milton because
Yes.
a lot of what he said, the same thing.
Mhm.
I have no confidence in the African Union, but I will say this, and Milton might remember this. Years ago, when I first started grounding with my brother Milton, I remember having a conversation at his brother's Andrew's home, and I brought up the thing about the train system because at the time my thinking was I was thinking about America and how much that the building of America also had to do with the train system, right? And this was Milton, about 19 years ago, whatever. So that's an idea that just came to me, and I think that in particular I would say is important because it now makes it where if we could move goods and services, and it could also facilitate in building the country up just as happened here in America. So I'll let my brother
Faisal take it and
Yeah,
then I'll wrap it up.
yeah, no, thanks. I think my two brothers have basically said what is possible here. But I just want to add to Brother Milton's first statement, and neither by any of the governments on the continent.
Yes, that was the
As lo-
missing part of my answer. Correct. I agree.
as long as those governments are appointed under the guise of free and fair elections.
Correct.
I think there's even some African presidents who don't even care anything for the guise of free and fair elections.
Right.
But these things are all critical, but they are also not alone. The list, any list would be limited.
Right.
I see about e-university and that's brilliant, but we have to start teaching the toddlers to have respect for being African so that they can become youngsters with respect for being an African, so that they can become young leaders who respect themselves for being an African. I think Chancellor Williams tries to illustrate the pride that the African used to have in being from here. We don't have that anymore.
Yeah.
And you can't teach one of the elders this now. This is something you have to teach the toddlers.
Right. I just want to add to one thing you just said, and then I'll let you finish. I teach an online class for a sister who runs a school in Brooklyn here in New York for pre-teen students, for pre-K, pre-kindergarten students. So she has me teach her teachers, about 15 of them, African history, African heritage, African culture, African pride, so that her teachers can then teach these toddlers.
Brilliant.
So it's happening here, and it should be happening elsewhere. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. That's the exact kind of thing that we at the Emerging El Kabulan is also doing. We have enrolled a similar person with skills like in curriculum development and so on, so that we can go to under the baobab tree, sit and so my thing of teaching is under the tree outside. I mean, like it's crazy that you put people between these sterile white walls and you expect them to learn anything. Isn't it Einstein, the European, that said, if you want to learn anything, go outside, travel, So I also want to, the first point I made was that the list is not exhaustive. The list doesn't recognize it all. It doesn't even, it talks about e-networking and so on and so on, but it doesn't say anything about the blockchain technology. And the blockchain technology is now just over 10 years old. It's now 15 years old, actually. And the region de très, I don't know if that's correct in French, but the reason for existing, the blockchain technology, the reason that it was developed was for the poor and the unbanked. And where do they live? Now I want to ask you another thing. If the poor and so on, they live in the global south, and so we're talking about Africa, so they live in Africa. Why is it that the governments of Africa have done everything except throw the spanner at the blockchain in terms of laughing at it, vilifying at it, making it illegal and so on? And Nigeria has just had a turnabout, and I tell you now, Nigeria is leading Africa in terms of the blockchain and technological development, in terms of metaverse, the metaverse, Web3 technologies, IoT, Internet of Things, and so on. And it is something that can do all of these things. They will be done probably not by the African Union and not by the governments, but by formations that have a true Pan-African footprint. Let's say the Emerging El Kabulan and whoever else joins from Cape to Cairo, Cape to Casablanca, it doesn't matter. We will do these things. Because my first question is, if you have a Pan-African conference, why do you need sponsors from Germany or from, we're always going to ask these people for money. We've got billionaires on this continent. Right. That's one. What we have under our feet, that we're selling our souls for a pot of lentil soup, is much more than the billionaires in Africa have. So this document, I mean, really, do you want to say to me that the fast train from Tokyo to Kyoto, I was lucky to be on it, but that was in 2010. Has there never been a decision to have a fast train from Cape to Cairo? I mean, come on. If the African Union was going to do this, or some government was going to do this, we'd be buying tickets and going everywhere. This thing about visas, when did this thing about visas start? It started 20 years ago. Free trade zone. Come on.
Saying, let's get serious.
Yes.
This is the
point.
point.
Get serious. If we don't get serious, nothing will get serious.
This is the point. So I want to, in closing, I want to extend an invitation. You can via Nduku reach out to us. There's a role for all of us.
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely.
I'm
We're on board.
actually in
let's put
talks
our
with
focus.
Oladele. I'm actually in talks with
We're on
him
board.
on
100%.
how Kumbukeni is
Great.
going to work with you.
Great.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
We're on
Great.
board.
We
Okay.
have
Well,
started that ball
thank you.
rolling, brother. We are very, very willing to work with you. On that note, brothers, did you have anything in closing to say, Colin, Milton?
I think this was an authentic Pan-African dialogue
Yes.
without mincing any words.
Yes. The
I'm very
ancestors are always
elated.
guiding
I'm very
us.
happy that the brother joined us. I'm very happy with all the comments that also
Absolutely.
accompanied today's conversation.
Yes.
Aluta continue.
There are no coincidences. Brother Faisal, you were meant to be here today with us, and we thank you for being here with us and for your contributions. Brother Colin, always you have become part of the family.
I see.
I don't even know. You know, there's a saying in Kiswahili.
I might have to just pencil myself in every week because
there's a saying
in
in
the last
Kiswahili.
minute call. So
Quickly, there's a saying in Kiswahili that says the first day a guest is a guest. The second day you give them a djembe, that is the hoe for digging, and send them to the garden to do work.
yes.
So everyone, thank you all
Okay.
for coming. Thank you all for joining us, and please,
Thank you very much.
yes,
Thank you.
quickly,
Thank you, Brother Faisal.
books quickly. Born in Blackness, Howard French. I put them in the chat. These are the ones
Okay.
that I used. Brother Faisal, if you want to hold up yours, if they're by you, you can go ahead and do that. A few people
Yeah, it's
asked.
not.
You can also add in the comments once we're done. The video will be up there. People asked what books you were talking about. That's
On
another
YouTube.
one. Yes. And solutions that are not of the African Union, Sheikh Anta Diop gives us at the end of this book solutions on what we should do towards liberation. So
And
thank
Chancellor
you.
Williams' destruction of
Listen.
African civilization, as Brother Faisal mentioned.
Someone added it there. Thank you so
Check
much, everyone. Again, you can email us, kumbukeni1@gmail.com. You can join our Patreon community, which is now available to everyone. Everything on the Patreon will be available to everyone. You just donate what you have, what you can afford. That is patreon.com/kumbukeni, or you can subscribe again to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@kumbukeni1. Siku njema, asanteni, kwaherini.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Bye bye, everyone.